Hello, and thank you for attending this webinar regarding the biggest obstacle to Permian oil and gas growth and production sustainability point forward, the Permian's watershed moment. My name is Christine Guerrero. I am a strategic advisor for the Octane All-Cap Value Energy ETF, which listed on the NASDAQ on October 1st of this year. The information that follows does not constitute investment advice, and it is not an offering of or a solicitation to buy or sell any security, product, or service. I am not a financial advisor nor a portfolio manager, and I do not hold any licenses to that effect. I am a petroleum engineer who has worked in oil and gas for nearly 2 decades before becoming a full-time investor in 2015. My industry experience includes drilling operations, technology development, economic and decision analysis, strategic planning, and business development. All observations are based on my own research, industry knowledge, and opinions. A watershed moment is an important event that changes the direction of history. It is a turning point, often recognized in hindsight, from which things will never be the same. It can be specific to a single country or population, or it may have global significance. I believe that the Permian is on a precipice of a watershed moment. The Permian Basin is one of the most well-known and oldest oil and gas producing regions in the United States and in the world. It stretches over 55 million acres that is roughly 250 miles broad and 300 miles long, larger than the state of Florida. This basin supports 52 counties across Texas and New Mexico. During its first boom, the Permian Basin accounted for over 20% of U.S. oil supply. Conventional oil production peaked at nearly 2 million barrels per day in the early 1970s, along with gas production of almost 10 billion cubic feet per day. Shortly after hitting its peak, though, production began declining and continued to do so for several decades. By the mid-2000s, oil production was down by almost 60% from its high point in the early 1970s. This trend would likely have continued into the present day were it not for the introduction of unconventional horizontal shale drilling and hydraulic fracturing in the early 2010s, which has led to a second oil and gas production boom over the past 14 years. Today, the Permian Basin is the world's most productive oil field. Thanks to shale hydraulic fracturing, it now produces approximately 6.3 million barrels of oil per day, 3.5 million barrels of natural gas liquids per day, and gas production of 24.6 billion cubic feet per day. This accounts for nearly 48% of total U.S. oil supply, 43% of total U.S. liquid supply, and approximately 22% of U.S. natural gas supply. Globally, that equates to more than 9% of daily liquid supply. Enverus estimates that since the Permian Basin started flowing in the 1920s, that approximately 30 billion barrels of oil and 75 trillion cubic feet of natural gas has been produced cumulatively. Now consider that the global petroleum industry is valued at approximately $5.3 trillion. This is one of the largest sectors in the world in terms of dollar value. You don't need to stretch your imagination to understand the Permian Basin's performance, and its forward outlook might be the most important factor for oil and gas investment sentiment and even the global economy. Energy commodities and markets are fundamentally interlinked. There are only about 10 oil fields in the world which produce more than 1 million barrels of oil per day. All but a few are in OPEC countries. But Saudi Arabia's onshore Ghawar is the largest conventional reservoir in the world. Its size and production durability has been prolific. Owned and operated by Saudi Aramco, it produced 5 million barrels of oil per day for decades. It is estimated to be able to continue producing oil at its current rate of 3.8 million barrels of oil per day well beyond 2050. The Permian Basin surpassed the Ghawar as the largest oil producer in 2019. Comparing these fields side by side tells us a lot about the differences between conventional oil fields and unconventional shale oil fields. The three items that stand out the most are the well decline rates, number of active wells, and the average water cut for the fields. Unconventional shale wells decline exponentially and hence require significantly many more wells than conventional oil fields. The steady construction of all these wells results in the Permian's methane emissions being over twice as high as any other oil and gas basin. If you work the math from this table, you can determine that the methane emissions per barrel are about 10% higher in the Permian Basin than in the Guar. This is data from the Permian Methane Analysis Project. The Permian also produces significantly more water per unit volume than it does oil and natural gas liquids, and it makes 3 to 4 times as much water per barrel of liquid hydrocarbons as the Guar. This makes water handling in the Permian Basin a unique challenge. Conventional oil wells generally consume as much water as they generate. They recycle their produced water by reinjecting it within the same formation to help maintain the reservoir's downhole pressure and enhance the long-term hydrocarbon recovery there. This is called enhanced oil recovery. But unlike conventional reservoirs, shale is impermeable, and its produced water cannot be reinjected back into its origin in a sustainable manner. Unconventional shale producers must find alternative formations and uses to dispose of their produced water. And the dirty truth is, the Permian Basin's wells produce significantly more water than they do oil. The average is 4 barrels of water for every barrel of oil, and in some areas, the ratio can be as high as 12 barrels of water per each barrel of oil. These numbers put the Permian Basin's average water cut higher than any other unconventional play. It's already producing nearly 19 million barrels of water per day. That's enough water to fill up Lake Travis and Austin every 20 months, and that number could nearly double by 2030 if oil and gas production continues to grow. The amount of water produced for every unit volume of oil produced is referred to as the water to oil ratio. The water-oil ratios vary across the basin and from well to well based on several dimensions, namely acreage quality, age of well, etc. This map from the Texas Produced Water Consortium includes only unconventional shale oil wells and shows us how the Delaware section of the Permian Basin tends to be wetter than the Midland. Water handling in the Permian typically consists of produced water being gathered from production sites and transported to saltwater disposal wells for underground injection. The sheer volume of water in the Permian necessitated development of pipeline systems to move produced water from production wells to disposal wells early in the basin's unconventional production history. At first, producers built these pipelines to keep water gathering needs from hindering their drilling schedules. But now, pipeline transportation to the injector wells is the preferred method, as it is the lowest cost alternative by nearly 2/3. You can easily see from this chart created by Pickering Energy Partners and B3 Insights that the Permian is creating a produced water tsunami, and that tsunami is growing faster than its oil production, as each unit volume of production is predominantly water. Even if oil production were to hold flat here, water production would continue to climb, as wells are known to water out as they age, and as the top tier acreage gets drilled up, operators will be activating higher counts of lower tier acreage that also tend to have higher water oil ratios than for tier 1. Given the forward 27% growth expectations that are often touted by the EIA for oil production for the Permian, we would expect to see the water issue only become worse. But as you'll learn in the following slides, the water disposal runway in the Permian is rapidly filling up, and that's evidenced by increased seismicity. Operators will have to find other ways to manage higher volumes of water at significantly greater cost to maintain the Permian's oil production dominance. Failure to do so will be environmentally catastrophic. Seismicity is the canary in our coal mine. In November 2019, a University of Texas study was published in the Journal of Geophysical Research Solid Earth, which found that earthquake activity in the Permian Basin near the city of Pecos had increased dramatically since 2009. These maps identify the locations of earthquakes from 2009 to 2007. Most were very small in magnitude. The study was important because it leveraged old unmined data to track seismic activity over nearly 20 years, much further back than all other studies, to show that as oil and gas production activity increased in the area, so did seismicity. Although researchers had generally thought that to be true, the statewide TexNet earthquake monitoring system has only been gathering data since 2017, making it impossible until now to determine with certainty when the cluster of seismic activity around Pecos really began. The researchers were able to extend the seismic record of the area by turning to the older Texar system near Lajitas, Texas, about 150 miles to the south. Texar is an array of 10 seismographs installed in the 1990s by scientists at Southern Methodist University to help track nuclear testing across the world. The trend of increasing seismic intensity is undeniable. And since then, Permian earthquakes have only grown in frequency and intensity. These are the seismic events recorded in TexNet since 2017 as of September 17th. The concern is that if we get enough magnitude 4 and magnitude 5 earthquakes, that statistically we should expect a larger earthquake. The Gutenberg-Richter law, established in 1944, states that the magnitudes of earthquakes are distributed exponentially. It's one of 3 fundamental laws of seismology. Therefore, if we had around 10 to 15 magnitude 5 earthquakes in a given area and period, and if the laws of natural seismology hold, a magnitude 6 earthquake would follow. In the past 2 years, this basin has experienced 5 magnitude 5 plus events and 57 magnitude 4 plus events. It's becoming obvious that if the Texas regulator fails to reduce produced water reinjection, the basin is likely to experience a magnitude 6 or greater earthquake within the next 2 years, which has the potential to cause major damage. Increasing seismicity year over year is clear evidence that overinjection of produced water is occurring within the Permian Basin. Note that the frequency axis of this chart is in logarithmic scale to best display the exponential distribution of the magnitude of earthquakes. 2023 was the first year to slow a decline in seismicity since it started rising in 2009. But if you extrapolate the events already experienced in 2024, it's set to be on the climb again. Not only has there been an increase in recorded earthquakes, but the magnitudes have grown as well. Since 2017, earthquakes of magnitude 2 to 2.9 have grown 8 times. Magnitude 3 to 3.9 have grown 10 times. Magnitude 4 to 4.9 have grown 10 times. And 5 earthquakes of a 5 magnitude or higher have occurred in the past 22 months. Never had magnitude 5 earthquakes been recorded here until 2022. This year's series of earthquakes are also different in that the combination of many small earthquakes over time and the recent activity has reportedly caused damage. In July of this year, more than 100 earthquakes occurred in a single week leading up to a 4.9 magnitude event. Thereafter, Scurry County Judge Dan Hicks wrote in his declaration of disaster that damage had been found throughout Scurry County in businesses and in residences. On September 16th, another 5.1 magnitude event hit Odessa. It's past time to raise the alarm to assure no more significant man-made large earthquakes are experienced going forward. Changes in injection practices and other oilfield activities may take months before seismicity abates, so it wouldn't be surprising to experience more earthquakes in the future, even after further regulations of injection practices and suspensions are put into effect. As of right now, approximately 50,000 barrels of produced water are being injected every single day. The void space in the injection zones that hold this water isn't growing. Void space is fixed, and water is incompressible. To demonstrate how proactive regulators have been in protecting local infrastructure and groundwater, let's talk about state-specific seismicity response since the advent of unconventional production and shale fracturing. This map shows the Advanced National Seismic System, a network that provides real-time information about seismic activity to researchers and emergency responders. Since 2017, the Bureau of Economic Geology's TexNet earthquake monitoring system has been integrated into the country's national monitoring system operated by the U.S. Geological Survey. It also highlights shale basin boundaries within the broader Texas region, as well as the locations of various seismic monitoring stations. As you're about to learn, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas have had state-specific responses to seismicity within their borders. Oklahoma can be considered the best in class in terms of seismicity response. Oil and gas provides approximately 13% of Oklahoma state tax revenue and 25% of statewide household earnings. The industry is very important to the state, but also is protecting groundwater and local infrastructure. For more than a century, the federal and state-approved industry practice of disposing of oil and gas produced water had worked as intended, with billions of barrels of wastewater disposed of using more than 3,000 disposal wells across the state. But after Oklahoma adopted the practice of horizontal drilling and shale fracturing, the amount of produced water needed to be injected drastically climbed. Eventually, the water saturated deep injection zones, increasing their internal pressure and stressing dozens, if not hundreds, of previously unknown underground faults that spiderweb across the state. From 2008 to 2015, oil production increased by 250%, and there was a significant increase in the number of induced seismic events, with the largest earthquake ever recorded in Oklahoma, a 5.8 magnitude earthquake near Pawnee, happening in September 2016. Since then, the seismicity rate in Oklahoma has declined, mostly due to the implementation of increased regulatory requirements and a slowdown of oil and gas development activity. Oil production peaked in 2019 and is down nearly 28% from its high today, along with Oklahoma's seismicity. Today, the underground disposal of produced water from oil and gas wells continue, but the practice is much more closely regulated, using regulations that limit both how much and where the wastewater can be injected. Further, seismographs deployed across the state actively alert officials of swarms of weaker earthquakes indicative of potential trouble spots, such that the regulators can suspend injection activity to prevent larger events. Oil and gas provides nearly 50% of New Mexico state revenue. The industry is critical for funding the state, but so is protecting the environment. In 2016, New Mexico effectively prohibited new shallow disposal wells in their section of the Permian Basin to prevent seismicity and protect groundwater. Deep disposal wells are not restricted, but they are considered risky and uneconomic, and it's not the preferred option. In 2018, New Mexico's Oil Conservation Division estimated the state to only have 10 years of produced water disposal capacity left. At that time, they were generating approximately 1 million barrels of water per day. In 2019, they created the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium and passed the Produced Water Act to encourage the oil and gas industry to favor reuse, recycling, and treatment options instead of consuming limited fresh water in their drilling and well completion operations. Although favorable, it's more expensive. In 2021, New Mexico placed stricter rules on injection wells and required operators to report volumes and pressures weekly to enable closer monitoring. Then in this year, they've already canceled 75 injection well permits, and further regulations and restrictions are proposed. Meanwhile, in neighboring Texas, permitting water disposal is easy and quick. Wells tend to be cheaper. So operators in New Mexico are now shipping about 2 million barrels of water per day of their produced water across the border into Texas for injection. Whether or not this was intentional, New Mexico has transferred its seismic risk to Texas. Less than 0.5% of the Permian Basin seismic events have been recorded on New Mexico's side of the basin. Now we get to Texas, where according to the Texas Oil and Gas Association, the oil and gas industry paid $26.3 billion in state and local taxes and state royalties in 2023, and may make up as much as 35% of the state's economy if you consider its impact on indirect and adjacent businesses. Established in 1891, the Railroad Commission that regulates the industry is the state's oldest agency. Its mission is to serve Texas through stewardship of natural resources and the environment. Oil is often the first thing that comes to mind when someone mentions Texas. So maybe it shouldn't come as a surprise that the Commission appears to be placing oil production before the environment. Since 2017, researchers within TexNet Seismic Monitoring and Center for Injection and Seismicity Group have made a concerted effort to better understand the causative hazards associated with induced seismicity across the state. And in 2019, they were able to link some of the Permian's seismicity not just to wastewater disposal, but also to hydraulic fracturing of shales. Starting in December 2021, seismic events in the Permian Basin were compelling the Texas Railroad Commission to restrict deep saltwater disposal and instead direct injections towards shallow zones based on epicenter locations. The aim was to reduce earthquakes greater than 3.5 magnitude. By January of this year, the Railroad Commission had suspended all deep disposal wells permitted within the Glendale and northern Culberson Reeves seismic response area. Deep disposal in the Stanton seismic response area continues but has been greatly reduced. However, in July of 2024, a Scurry County judge had to issue a disaster declaration and seek state aid for recovery following a series of high-frequency earthquakes in a single week. This past week, another 5.1 magnitude earthquake occurred, shaking Odessa. The continued increases in frequency and scale of these earthquakes will magnify public outcry and mandate further restrictions. This will drive forward either curtailments in water injection or adoption of beneficial reuse technology for produced water treatment, but not without trade-offs in break-even well economics that would likely reduce oil and gas production. Texas's regulatory response to reduce seismicity lags Oklahoma and New Mexico and is glaring as seismicity continues to increase along with shale fracturing and oil and gas production growth. Seismicity has only increased since 2009, and it has greatly increased since 2019. Further correlating with increases in oil production growth and produced water disposal volumes. This figure was provided by B3 Insights and shows both substantial shallow and deep disposal south of the Texas-New Mexico border and relatively minor disposal in New Mexico. This difference reflects the disparity discussed between regulatory actions between the two states, with easier and faster permitting for shallow wells in Texas, a moratorium on shallow disposal in New Mexico, and lower deep well drilling costs in Texas. For Texas, the Railroad Commission's feeble restrictions thus far have been in specific seismically active areas where wastewater injection has been reduced by about 50% for shallow and moderately shallow wells, and up to 90% in deep injection wells. These restrictions are driving injection from deep zones into shallow zones elsewhere, which may not solve seismicity issues and risk over-pressuring additional shallow zones, damaging aging oil and gas infrastructure and threatening protected aquifers. Over the past 10 years, more than 30 billion barrels of water have been injected into the Permian Basin. Up to 17 billion barrels have been injected into shallow zones in the Delaware Basin and about 8.9 billion barrels into the Midland Basin. By contrast, only about 3.8 billion barrels have been injected into the Delaware Basin deep and 4.5 billion barrels into the Midland Basin deep. Injecting produced wastewater into shallow formations holds further risk beyond simply inducing seismicity. Overpressuring can fracture the reservoir seals and affect subsurface water control. This is a particular risk for shallow formations, as it brings with it the potential to create cascading problems, such as abandoned wells losing isolation and discharging to the surface, or subsurface reinjection into aquifers and other zones. Regulators are aware of this situation because it's happening, and it will be discussed next. So far, they have only applied localized solutions by shutting off a limited number of water disposal wells nearby, rather than more proactive approaches which would indirectly constrain oil production. Vulnerability is a function of materials, age, maintenance, and the system's exposure. So consider that the Permian Basin holds nearly 250,000 leak paths. The well counts shown here are inclusive of Texas Districts 8, 8A, and 7C, along with New Mexico's Lee and Eddy counties as of September 15th. Any wells outside those survey areas weren't extracted for this analysis. Approximately 50,000 wells have been drilled since 2001 in the shale boom, and approximately 5,500 new wells are being added each year. Most of the producing wells are what we call stripper wells. A stripper well is a well that makes 15 barrels of oil per day or less over the past 12 months. They can be economic so long as they're carefully managed by people who understand low rate operations and can keep production going without high overhead and operating cost. Overhead is often the largest issue, so large companies will flip these wells to smaller companies. Furthermore, there are an unknown number of phantom wells which may never be fully understood. These undocumented wells are a byproduct of lax record keeping in the earliest days of the oil and gas industry. They include locations that were drilled illegally, prior to state archives, or for which records have been lost. Remember, this is a 100-year-old oil production basin. The Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission estimated in a 2021 report that there are between 310 and 800,000 undocumented orphaned wells nationwide. Many of those wells will be in the Permian Basin. So now let's touch on basic well design. The upper section of well construction hasn't changed much in 100 years. Wells essentially consist of telescoping pipes that are surrounded by cement on the outside to fully seal the holes and to protect the pipes from corrosion. When a well is properly abandoned, the inside of the pipe will also include a cement plug to cap the wellbore prior to cutting the wellhead off and ideally returning the well site to its original condition. Now consider how brittle cement may become after years, after decades. Imagine how susceptible this cement might be to cracks and degradation when exposed to repeated seismic events. Every single well in this region has the potential to become a leak path. As shown earlier, there are at least 163,000 active wells and 86,000 inactive wells on record in the Permian Basin. Texas and New Mexico both have tens of thousands of wells that have been sitting idle or even partially abandoned for decades. Stripper wells eventually become low-rate wells that can't be economically stimulated and don't pay enough to cover proper abandonment. Left unplugged, many of these wells leak methane, brine, and trace hydrocarbons and other toxins. Furthermore, companies have very little incentive to properly plug these wells. It's cheaper to sell them or to walk away and forfeit the small bonds currently required by the state. It should come as no surprise that thousands of old wellbores exist in the Permian Basin. Some never plugged, some plugged before regulation of wells, and others plugged in violation of regulations. When an over-pressurized formation breaks through into one of these wellbores or finds its way to the surface along cracks nearby, it can become a zombie well. Between 1993 and 2008, orphan wells contaminated Texas groundwater at least 30 times, according to the Groundwater Protection Council. It's logical to conclude that the issue has soared since then. I'm not sure how many of these zombie wells will rise before the Railroad Commission becomes proactive rather than reactive. The growing plug and abandonment liability is staggering. The only way the Commission can fully address this problem is by properly regulating, reducing, and even eliminating produced water injection into all formations within the basin. In a 2023 paper, scientists said leaking wells in the Permian Basin were a growing threat to water sources and human health. Then in August 2024, Reuters reported that old wells were reopening and becoming zombies in as little as a year following their formal abandonment. In that report, oil and gas attorney Sarah Stogner claimed to possess a list of over 100 actively leaking orphan wells with no responsible owners. These wells are listed in RRC records as having been properly plugged. But those plugging standards don't account for today's over-pressurized and seismically active conditions. The Railroad Commission is now rightly under increased pressure to step up its oversight, as over the last few years, more and more abandoned wells have started to spill or even gush geyser-like, form salt and chemical-laden lakes, or cause sinkholes. Texas is playing Russian roulette with the environment. In Crane County, one such well reopened on Meister Ranch on New Year's Day in January 2022, shooting wastewater 100 feet in the air and flowed nearly 15 million gallons of wastewater before being capped. That would fill about 23 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The Railroad Commission immediately halted operations of injection wells within 1.2 miles as a precaution. They believed this well to be CT-112, which would have been drilled in the 1940s before being sold to Chevron in 1984. But that old well was found undisturbed 10 feet away from the leaking well. Chevron plugged this zombie, but months later, they still don't know who actually drilled or owned it. Then in July of this year, a study from the Southern Methodist University was able to link the blowout to water traveling along a geological fault from a cluster of 9 injector wells nearly 12 miles away. The region is heavily faulted, raising concerns about the possibility of widespread groundwater contamination and suggesting that the current emergency response from the Railroad Commission is insufficient. Researchers pulled publicly available data on injection volumes at those wells and found they lined up closely to the surface swelling that preceded the blowout. According to the paper, injection at those 9 wells began in 2018 at a rate of about 362 gallons per day, doubled to 720,000 gallons per day in late 2019, and in late 2020 it doubled again to 1.5 million gallons. That is 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools crammed underground every day, which is when the ground near the blowout site began to inflate. Less than 2 years later, another significant blowout occurred just a mile away. This zombie well was reported on Bill White's ranch on December 7, 2023, and likely flowed more than 18 million gallons of wastewater before it was plugged on January 29, 2024. That would fill about 28 Olympic-sized swimming pools. White purchased this ranch in 2012, and despite there being no record of the well that erupted there, the commission paid $2.5 million to plug it and clean up the spill to ensure safety. The spokesman said that the commission is seeking to identify the person or company responsible for drilling it. Good luck. Complicating the effort are thousands of undocumented wells, like this one, that erupted on White's land. With no record of its existence, it's difficult to determine who is responsible for capping it and cleaning it up, if they even are still alive or even exist. A San Antonio laboratory tested samples of the water spewed here on behalf of the commission, finding it contained 0.05 milligrams per liter of benzene, a widely known carcinogen. That's 10 times the EPA's maximum allowable level for drinking water. Benzene is a chemical found mostly in crude oil and gasoline. These traces of benzene in white spill were the only chemical suggesting that the well could have been drilled for oil and gas, the Commission said in a statement. Such a blowout demonstrates that if wells remain unattended, they can pose serious environmental risks. Finding and plugging them is a monumental task. White, a fourth-generation West Texas rancher, has watched this problem on his land grow for years. He said the Commission has plugged about 10 old wells leaking onto the surface of his property, but each time they do, another one starts flowing. Miles southwest of White's Ranch is a body of water known as Lake Bomer. The Sloan Blair No. 1 well was drilled in 1951. It started leaking decades ago and is the water source of Lake Bomer. The well had been abandoned and transferred to the landowner after it had finished drilling, and no commercial quantities of oil were found. But then, the well's casing corroded in a subsurface salt layer, allowing toxic salt water to flow uncontrolled to surface, which has now created a half-mile wide spill. This spill is about 60 acres in size and growing. It's filled with heavy metals like arsenic and is slightly radioactive. The water is 3 times saltier than seawater, and the sulfate level is 25 times higher than the legal limit for drinking water. No surprise, the lake's shore is lined with dead trees. The Lake Bomer spill highlights an uneven approach to environmental cleanup by Texas's Railroad Commission. It has millions of dollars to plug orphan wells and boasts that it plugs over 1,500 orphan wells a year. However, the 3-member elected body has fought against groundwater districts and landowners about who is responsible for plugging certain wells. For Lake Bomer, the Middle Pecos Groundwater Conservation District believes that this well was drilled for oil and that oil-filled wastewater is the source of the leak. They are blaming nearby oil and gas operators for over-pressurizing their fields in order to extract more crude, and the Railroad Commission should be responsible for it. However, the Commission conveniently claims that it does not have jurisdiction over wells if there is no record that they ever produced oil, and that under state law, landowners are responsible for plugging cost of water wells. Texas groundwater districts have documented numerous leaking abandoned wells and have started taking legal action against the Railroad Commission to compel the agency to plug them. In the meantime, the zombie well is causing havoc. The lake continues to grow. The gas sampling has shown that the wellhead is producing concentrations of H2S that are over 14,000 parts per million. It only takes exposure to 700 parts per million of H2S gas for a person to pass out and die. At 1,000 parts per million, an individual will be killed instantly, according to the U.S. Department of Labor. If this situation doesn't alarm you, it should. Maintaining today's prolific oil and gas production level while avoiding escalating subsurface risk and navigating a dynamic regulatory landscape alongside methane emission concerns will be the defining challenge for Permian Basin operators going forward. The relentless tsunami of produced water they are generating in order to maintain the Permian's global significance makes me question the hidden cost of these barrels. It feels like we're asking future generations to clean up the mess we made to produce cheap oil while getting rich during shale's boom. Seismic activity is directly correlated with oil and gas production growth, as water handling practices pressurize non-native subsurface formations where it's being injected and rehomed for long-term storage. Seismicity will not go away so long as millions of barrels of produced water are being re-injected within the basin. Current Railroad Commission actions, they're not solving problems. They are simply window dressing and shifting the issue into a shallow failure path rife with cascading environmental concerns. Shallow formations can and will overpressurize. further damaging aging oil and gas infrastructure and threatening protected groundwater aquifers. Don't dismiss the reality that today's shallow injection is coming on the heels of 15 years of escalating seismicity. It's impossible to know the magnitude of damage that may have already occurred and is festering there. Old wells and infrastructure were not built to withstand higher pressure environments, nor with earthquake sustainability in mind. The zombie wells presented demonstrate the vulnerability and environmental risk potential within the region. In my opinion, the state's regulatory response for Texas is negligent and continues to invite excessive pollution and liability risk. The solution to seismicity is simple, but it's going to be expensive. There are three ways to manage produced water: injection into a water disposal well or into an EOR well, recycling to a clean brine standard for oilfield drilling and fracturing, or clean to a water quality acceptable for beneficial agricultural reuse. Injecting produced water into saltwater disposal wells or for enhanced oil recovery is the most cost-effective way to manage produced water, and that's why it's dominant. A 2021 survey of producers provided a working range of 60 cents to 70 cents per barrel for produced water. Then, depending on the water-oil ratio of each producer's inventory, we can calculate that their break-even cost of producing oil would have included $2 to $8 per barrel of bottom-line water handling expense. Currently, 90% of the disposal is via injection through pipelines. The other 10% is by trucking, which is 3 times more expensive, but those wells are stranded and don't have pipeline access. The cost of transporting water can negatively impact well economics. So a new industry of water midstream companies has emerged to handle these increasing volumes. However, concerns about the necessary scale of field development, water sourcing and disposal limitations, and the development of regulations that could dramatically impact the marketplace have all weighed on these midstream ventures. As with any business, companies operating in a free market will favor methods that offer the lowest cost and highest reliability. Currently, that means disposal via injection, or treating produced water to a clean brine standard for reuse in hydraulic fracturing and in other completion operations. Treating produced water typically costs about 75 cents to $1.20 per barrel of water. This is significantly higher than reinjection. There is also a lot of talk currently about beneficial reuse of some of the Permian's produced water, and at least 13 pilot studies that I know of. But reality is, for beneficial reuse to be a viable option, treatment costs to achieve a water quality that is suitable for agricultural use and protective of public health and the environment will have to be competitive with the marginal cost of future disposal. That targeted marginal treatment cost is expected to average $1 per barrel. Compare that to current treatment options, which average $2.55 per barrel, and in some cases as high as $10 per barrel. Produced water from the Permian Basin is extremely salty, contaminated, and not uniform in quality. At this time, there are not any scalable operations for treating produced water in the Permian to a quality beyond that necessary for reuse in hydraulic fracturing, more commonly referred to as a clean brine standard. A technology step change would be required to enable this alternative. By now it should be clear that seismic events are telling us the Permian Basin has a serious problem. Operators have been shifting water injection from seismically sensitive areas to less sensitive areas, and all the while seismicity keeps climbing. We are running out of produced water injection capacity, period. In all likelihood, we have already experienced peak injection volumes, and they will only continue to decline in the years ahead as further regulatory restrictions come into effect to protect groundwater and infrastructure by limiting the maximum injection pressures and volumes aimed to prevent large-scale man-made earthquakes, the same as was done in Oklahoma. Injection scarcity conditions will increase the cost of water handling until well economics break down. In other words, not having the means to economically manage produced water could shut down or at best restrict further oil and gas production from the Permian. The sheer volume of produced water makes some degree of in-basin water disposal indispensable. Fortunately, regulators in New Mexico and Texas have been making it easier for operators to reuse produced water for fracking, and producers have been implementing recycling water to a clean brine standard for oilfield purposes to reduce some of this injection pressure. It's expected that 80% of the drilling and fracking in New Mexico is now consuming recycled water, and Texas is up to 50% utilization this year. If producers were to convert 100% of their operations to recycled water, the industry would be consuming about 7 million barrels per day of their own produced water. That still leaves 12 million barrels per day of excess produced water and growing. That water has to go somewhere. Otherwise, oil production has to decline. According to analysis performed by B3 Insights and Pickering Energy Partners, using data from 2021 to 2022, starting as soon as next year, the industry will be forced to maximize water recycling or risk hitting the ceiling on operational disposal capacity. In June of 2024, Matthias Blogan with Pickering Energy Partners wrote, "In the absence of adequate recycling demand and saltwater disposal capacity, operators may have to shut in production or slow completion plans as they will not have a large enough outlet for their produced barrels. Some local areas are already experiencing water disposal constraints as saltwater disposal capacity and demand dynamics vary across the basin." Also noteworthy is that actual water production from 2023 was 18.9 million barrels per day, which is more than 1 million barrels per day higher than this 2021 to 2022 model predicted. In closing, the Permian's watershed moment is upon us. Unless a beneficial reuse treatment becomes economical, or the average price of WTI crude climbs much higher, justifying water mobilization expenses outside the basin, oil production is unlikely to grow much further and may even decline. Thank you.